Racist woman orders Big Shaq to leave, but she has no idea who he really is. She thinks she owns the place, but in a shocking twist, the man she just disrespected built the entire mall. What happens next will leave her speechless, and the internet in flames. Stay tuned, because karma is about to be served. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun gleamed against the towering glass structure of the O'Neal Grand Plaza, a shopping mall unlike any other in the city. It wasn't just a mall, it was a symbol, a monument to success, built from the ground up by Shaquille O'Neal, known to everyone as Big Shaq. The place radiated modern elegance, from the sleek black marble floors to the golden accents that lined its massive archways. The air inside was filled with the faint scent of fresh roasted coffee from the cafe near the entrance, the hum of conversations, and the rhythmic beat of a distant jazz melody playing through the speakers. Shaq walked through the mall like a regular visitor, towering above the crowd in his crisp navy polo and tailored black slacks. He wasn't the kind of owner who stayed locked away in an office. He wanted to feel the pulse of his creation, to be part of the life that flowed through its halls. He nodded at the employees, exchanged jokes with the baristas, and even stopped by a sneaker store where a young boy gawked up at him in awe. "Whoa, you're Big Shaq!" the boy gasped. Shaq chuckled, crouching slightly to meet the kid's eyes. "That's what they tell me. You hoop?" The kid nodded vigorously. "Trying to. Coach says I need to work on my footwork." Shaq patted his shoulder. "Footwork's everything, young blood. Keep at it, and one day you'll be running this mall instead of just shopping in it." The boy's mother beamed with pride as Shaq ruffled the kid's hair and moved on, the interaction a reminder of why he had built this place. It wasn't just about money. It was about opportunity, legacy, and proving that success had no boundaries, especially not the ones society tried to impose. As he strolled past high-end stores, luxury brands, and bustling food courts, Shaq felt the weight of every decision that had brought him here. Owning a mall was never part of his original plan, but when he saw how few black entrepreneurs controlled commercial real estate, he knew he had to change that. This place wasn't just his, it was a statement. Black excellence, unshakable and thriving. But not everyone saw it that way. Near the entrance of an upscale clothing boutique, a woman stood stiffly, her posture screaming disapproval. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a beige blazer with pearl earrings, she held herself with the air of someone who believed in old money, old values, and an unspoken hierarchy. And to her, Shaq, despite his tailored clothes and undeniable presence, didn't belong. He felt her eyes on him before he even turned. The kind of stare that wasn't just curiosity, but calculated scrutiny. The kind of stare that had followed him long before he became a businessman. It was the look of someone who was mentally placing him somewhere he didn't fit. Shaq exhaled slowly, his instincts tingling. He had faced this before. In boardrooms, in high-end stores, in neighborhoods where people asked, "Can I help you?" in a tone that meant you shouldn't be here. But this was different. This was his domain. He kept walking, but the woman's presence lingered in his mind. Something about her wasn't just casual disdain. There was purpose in the way she watched him. As he reached the central atrium, he paused. The massive skylight above cast golden beams over the grand fountain, where families tossed coins and made wishes. It was a vision of what he had dreamed for this place: community, joy, success, intertwined. But just as he took in the moment, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." He turned, and there she was, Victoria Calloway, the woman who had been watching him. Her smile was tight, forced, the kind of expression that masked something deeper, something colder. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Something I can help you with." She folded her arms, her nails tapping against the fabric of her blazer. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. You seemed lost." There it was. Shaq didn't react immediately. He let her words settle, feeling the weight of what she really meant. Lost. In a place he built. He glanced around, noticing a few employees subtly watching, a few customers slowing their steps. He wasn't the only one who caught the undertone. The tension in the air had shifted. Shaq smiled. Not a wide grin, not a laugh, just a knowing, quiet smile. I know exactly where I am. Victoria's expression flickered for half a second, but she recovered. Of course. It's just, well, this is a high-end establishment. We like to ensure that everyone here is... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Meant to be here. Silence stretched between them. Shaq could feel the weight of every injustice wrapped in polite conversation. The coded language, the thinly veiled bias. This wasn't new, but it never got old. Shaq glanced at the massive golden plaque near the entrance, where his name was etched into history. Shaquille O'Neal, owner and founder. He turned back to Victoria, his smile unwavering. I appreciate the concern, ma'am, but I promise you, I belong here. The shift in power was instant. The whispers started. Employees exchanged looks. Customers eyed the situation with interest. The mall security team stood at a distance, observing, uncertain if they should step in. Victoria pursed her lips, glancing at the security guards as if waiting for them to react. But they didn't move. Because unlike her, they knew exactly who Shaq was. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He had already won the moment he spoke. Victoria's fingers tightened around her designer purse. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. She exhaled sharply. Well, enjoy your day. She turned on her heel and walked away, her steps a little too quick, her composure barely holding. Shaq let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the weight of the encounter. He had built this place, and no one, not even Victoria Calloway, was going to make him feel like he didn't belong in it. Victoria Calloway had spent her entire life believing she was the kind of person who belonged, everywhere. Born into wealth, raised in exclusivity, she had never stepped into a space she couldn't claim as her own. From high-end boutiques to country clubs, she carried herself with the certainty that the world revolved around people like her. And when something, or someone, disrupted that, she took it upon herself to restore the order she believed in. Today, that disruption was Shaquille O'Neal. She had noticed him the moment she stepped into the mall, towering over the crowd, moving with a confidence that unsettled her. At first, she dismissed him as some overgrown athlete wandering where he didn't belong. But when she saw people greeting him with familiarity, employees showing deference, customers nodding with respect, her unease turned into irritation. This was not how things were supposed to be. She had seen this mall in its infancy, long before it became the grand establishment it was today. She had lunched with the city's elite, discussing its potential, imagining the kind of people it would attract. People like her. And now, standing in its gleaming halls, she felt a distinct sense of loss, as though something had tainted the vision she once had for the place. And she knew exactly what, or who, that something was. She watched from a distance, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the handle of her designer purse. Shaq was walking through the mall like he owned it, because, as she would soon learn, he did. But she didn't know that yet. All she saw was a man who didn't fit into the carefully curated environment she had imagined. Her first instinct was to take action. People like her didn't wait for others to fix problems. They handled things themselves. She walked briskly toward a group of store employees gathered outside an upscale boutique, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile. "Excuse me," she said, her tone just sweet enough to mask the steel beneath. "That man over there, do you know who he is?" The employees exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a young woman named Natalie, hesitated before answering. "You mean Mr. O'Neal?" Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Mr. O'Neal?" "Yes," Natalie said carefully. "Shaquille O'Neal. He owns the mall." Victoria's smile didn't falter, but something in her posture stiffened. She processed the information quickly, shifting strategies in an instant. If this man was more than just some intruder, she would need a different approach. "Interesting," she said lightly, her tone unreadable. "But ownership doesn't mean he can just wander around, does it? This is a business after all." Natalie hesitated again, unsure how to respond. Victoria didn't wait for her to figure it out. Instead, she turned toward a mall security officer standing nearby. A man named Franklin, who had worked in this place long enough to know exactly who Shaq was. "Excuse me," Victoria said, shifting her full attention to him. "I need to report something." Franklin, a sturdy man in his early 50s, glanced up from his radio. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria folded her arms, exuding the kind of authority that had been ingrained in her since birth. "There's a very large man roaming the mall, and quite frankly, he's making people uncomfortable." Franklin followed her gaze and immediately spotted Shaq. His face remained neutral, but Victoria sensed hesitation. She pressed on. "Now, I don't know if he's supposed to be here, but this is a high-end establishment, and we can't afford disruptions. I'd like you to—" "I can't do that, ma'am," Franklin interrupted, his voice firm but polite. Victoria's eyes flashed. "Excuse me?" "I said, I can't do that," Franklin repeated, "because that man is the owner of this mall." The words landed like a slap. For a moment, Victoria was stunned into silence. She stared at Franklin, her mind scrambling for a response. The idea that someone like Shaquille O'Neal, a former basketball player no less, could own a place like this was absurd to her. Ownership was for people like her, not for men who had spent their lives sweating on a basketball court. She recovered quickly. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "that certainly changes things." But it didn't. Not for her. If anything, it made the situation worse. Because now, she wasn't just looking at someone who didn't belong. She was looking at someone who had taken something that should have belonged to someone else. As she walked away, her mind was already working. If she couldn't remove him from the mall directly, she would find another way. Minutes later, she was dialing a number, her fingers tapping impatiently against the counter of a jewelry store as she waited for the call to connect. "James," she said smoothly, when the person on the other end picked up. "We have a problem." James Calloway, her brother, wasn't just an influential businessman. He was a man with connections in city planning, in corporate investments, and most importantly, on the mall's board of investors. Victoria kept her voice low, ensuring no one around her could hear. "Did you know Shaquille O'Neal owns O'Neal Grand Plaza?" There was a pause on the other end. Then James exhaled. "I had heard something about that." "Why?" "Because it's becoming a problem," Victoria said, her tone sharp. "This mall was supposed to attract the right kind of people, but now, it's turning into something else." James sighed. "Victoria, you need to be careful with how you handle this." "I am being careful," she snapped. "But we need to do something before this place loses its credibility. There must be a way to make the investors reconsider who's really fit to run this place." James hesitated again. "You're talking about undermining the man who built the entire mall. That's not going to be easy." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Then we'll just have to be smart about it." She ended the call, her mind already racing with possibilities. Shaquille O'Neal may have built this mall, but as far as she was concerned, he wasn't meant to have it. And if there was one thing Victoria Calloway knew how to do, it was make sure people stayed in the places they were supposed to be. Victoria Calloway moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the pristine marble floor as she made her way back toward the atrium. Her heart pounded, but not with uncertainty, with determination. She had worked too hard, cultivated too many connections, to let a man like Shaquille O'Neal waltz through this place, as if it belonged to him, as if he were one of them. She spotted Shaq standing near the central fountain, speaking casually with an employee. He was relaxed, unaware of the storm brewing. That irritated her more than anything. He didn't belong here, and he certainly shouldn't feel comfortable. Her voice sliced through the space, sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, sir." Shaq turned slowly, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers with calm curiosity. His stature was impossible to ignore. He loomed over her, his broad frame radiating an effortless confidence that only fueled her annoyance. "I don't know who you think you are," Victoria continued, her voice loud enough for the nearby shoppers to hear. "But you need to leave immediately. This isn't a place for loitering." Shaq raised a single brow, his expression unreadable. A few murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had started to gather. Some exchanged confused glances. Others pulled out their phones, sensing an altercation worth capturing. "Loitering?" Shaq finally said, his voice even. "I own this place." A hushed silence fell over the group. Even Victoria hesitated for half a second, but she recovered quickly, scoffing. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "This mall is a premier establishment, not some basketball court for former athletes looking to relive their glory days." Shaq let the words settle, but his face remained calm. "I built this mall," he said again, this time a little louder, ensuring that everyone heard him. "You can check the deed. My name's on it." Victoria's lips pursed. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her now. The employees she had spoken to earlier were watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. Customers lingered, whispering amongst themselves. Some were already recording. But Victoria was not a woman who backed down. She straightened her blazer, exhaling sharply. "I don't care what you claim, but you're disturbing the peace. I suggest you leave before security is forced to escort you out." Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. He could have dismissed her, walked away and let her fume. But he had learned long ago that people like Victoria only grew bolder when left unchecked. "I'm disturbing the peace?" he asked, crossing his arms. "By standing in my own mall, talking to my employees?" Victoria's eyes flickered with something sharp, but she masked it quickly. "I'll give you one last chance to leave before I make this official." Shaq sighed, rubbing his chin, as if genuinely debating his next move. Then, with an almost amused smirk, he gestured toward the mall entrance. "By all means, make it official." Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed the mall's security office. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A few minutes later, 2 security guards arrived. Isaiah Carter and Roy Bennett, both seasoned professionals who had worked at the mall since its opening. The moment they saw Shaq standing there, their expressions shifted from neutral to tense. They knew exactly who he was. "Ma'am," Isaiah said carefully, looking between Victoria and Shaq. "What seems to be the issue?" "This man is causing a disturbance," Victoria said smoothly. "He refuses to leave the premises after I asked him multiple times." Isaiah and Roy exchanged a glance. They had been trained for situations like these, but this was not an ordinary situation. This was the owner of the mall being accused of trespassing. Roy cleared his throat. Ma'am. This is Mr. O'Neal." Victoria's face remained impassive, but Shaq could see the way her fingers tightened around her purse strap. "I don't care who he is," she said firmly. "He's refusing to comply with mall policies." Shaq watched the 2 security officers carefully. He didn't envy their position. They were caught between a woman who clearly wielded influence and the actual owner of the establishment. Isaiah hesitated before speaking. "Mr. O'Neal." Shaq held up a hand. "You don't have to explain anything to me, Isaiah." Victoria's gaze darted between them, suspicion creeping into her features. You know him?" Isaiah nodded stiffly. "Everyone here does, ma'am." Victoria exhaled sharply, her patience thinning. "Then do your job and remove him. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the board. You work for this mall's security, not for some celebrity who thinks he owns the place." Shaq let out a short laugh at that. "I don't think I own this place, Ms. Calloway." He turned slightly and pointed toward the large golden plaque near the entrance, where his name was engraved under the words, "O'Neal Grand Plaza, established by Shaquille O'Neal." Victoria's gaze followed his hand, her face paling slightly. But she wasn't done yet. "None of this changes the fact that he's creating a scene," she insisted, her voice louder now, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that brings down an establishment like this." That was when the crowd reacted. A woman standing nearby scoffed audibly. "Brings it down? Lady, this mall wouldn't even exist without him." Another voice chimed in. "You really just tried to kick out the owner?" The murmurs grew louder, a mix of disbelief and frustration filling the space. More cameras were lifted, capturing every second of Victoria's unraveling. Isaiah and Roy stood frozen, clearly unwilling to escalate this any further. They weren't about to forcibly remove their boss from his own property. Victoria's breathing was shallow now, her usual commanding presence diminishing. She had expected immediate compliance, unquestioned authority. She had not expected this. Shaq took a step forward, lowering his voice just enough so that only she could hear. "You really thought you could come in here, throw your weight around, and make me disappear. Victoria's jaw tightened, her pulse visible at her temple. This isn't over. Shaq nodded. No, I don't think it is. But I promise you, it won't end the way you want it to. She stared at him for a long moment before turning on her heel and storming out, her posture rigid, her defeat undeniable. As she disappeared through the entrance, Shaq exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. He turned to Isaiah and Roy. Appreciate you guys stepping in? Isaiah nodded, still looking a little stunned. Didn't really do much, sir. Shaq chuckled. Sometimes doing nothing is exactly the right thing. He turned back toward the mall, where employees and customers were still watching, some shaking their heads, others smiling in quiet satisfaction. The story was already out there. The videos, the tweets, the headlines. Victoria Calloway had tried to publicly humiliate him. Instead, she had humiliated herself. The murmurs in the crowd had yet to settle when the mall's head of security, Donovan Carter, stepped into the tense scene. His arrival was unhurried, his presence one of quiet authority. A former cop with more than 25 years of experience, he was a man who had seen almost everything. But what he saw now was a situation that could spiral out of control if not handled correctly. Donovan surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. Shaquille O'Neal, standing tall and composed, exuding the kind of confidence that came from years of fighting battles that weren't always physical. And across from him, Victoria Calloway, her carefully curated poise barely concealing the humiliation simmering beneath her perfectly powdered exterior. The crowd, a mix of employees, customers, and passers-by, stood in a crescendo of whispers, their phones raised, capturing every second. Victoria's eyes lit up at the sight of Donovan, as if he were the last lifeline keeping her from drowning. She lifted her chin and turned to face him. Finally, someone who understands order, she announced, her voice carrying a false sense of relief. This man is refusing to leave after I repeatedly asked him to. He's disturbing the environment and making people uncomfortable. Donovan glanced at Shaq, then back at Victoria. His jaw tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. He had known Shaq since the mall had been built. Shaq was the reason Donovan even had this job. Still, he had a duty to fulfill, and protocol dictated that he hear both sides before making a decision. Mr. O'Neal, Donovan said, keeping his voice measured. Is there a reason you're still here despite the request to leave? Shaq exhaled slowly, nodding before reaching into his pocket. I figured this was coming, he said casually, unlocking his phone. So let's get this over with. Victoria smirked, crossing her arms. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Call a lawyer? Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned the screen toward Donovan, tilting it slightly so that the entire crowd could see. A digital copy of the mall's ownership deed shined on the display, unmistakable and irrefutable. The air in the mall shifted. Some people gasped, others chuckled, shaking their heads. Employees who had been hesitant to intervene now grinned behind their counters. The weight of proof had crashed down on Victoria's narrative, shattering it into irreparable pieces. Donovan leaned in, reading the document carefully. He didn't need long, he already knew it was legitimate. He had seen the original papers himself on the day Shaq had signed them. Victoria, however, refused to look at the screen. This proves nothing, she scoffed, her voice strained. Anyone can fabricate a document on a phone. Shaq let out a deep, knowing chuckle. All right, he said, unbothered. He turned to Donovan. You've got access to the official lease records, right? Donovan nodded slowly. Then go check it, Shaq said simply, sliding his phone back into his pocket. I'll wait. The challenge was clear. Shaq wasn't asking for validation. He was letting the truth dismantle the lie on its own. Victoria's face twisted into something sharp and ugly. She hadn't anticipated this moment, hadn't prepared for the cold slap of undeniable reality. I don't have time for this nonsense, she snapped. The fact remains. He is causing a scene, and you, as head of security, should be handling it. Donovan looked at her carefully, his expression unreadable. Handling it how exactly? Victoria's lips parted slightly, as though she hadn't expected the question. By removing him, of course. Donovan let the silence stretch between them, Then he spoke clearly and firmly. I don't remove owners from their own property. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few people clapped. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, watching as Victoria's last shred of control slipped through her fingers. She turned on her heel, facing the onlookers. This is absurd, she hissed. Look at how you're all behaving. Do you think this is normal? That we should just let people like this take over spaces like these? Shaq stiffened slightly at the phrasing. People like this. The room reacted instantly. A wave of disapproval rolled through the crowd. Phones were no longer just recording, they were documenting history. Shaq took a step forward, his voice calm but cutting. Say what you really mean, Victoria. Victoria's nostrils flared, but she hesitated. She had already said too much, already let the mask slip farther than she intended. Donovan cleared his throat. Ms. Calloway, I think it's best if you step away before this escalates further. She turned back to him, eyes narrowing. Escalates? What's left to escalate? You're all standing here letting this charade continue. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed a number. I'll be calling the Board of Investors. They'll hear about this, I assure you. Shaq smirked. Go ahead, he said. I have a feeling they're watching this already. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The realization dawned on her. The damage had already been done. The videos would spread. The truth would overshadow any lie she tried to spin. Donovan nodded toward 2 additional security personnel who had arrived. Escort Ms. Calloway to her vehicle, he instructed. Make sure she leaves without further incident. Victoria's face flushed a deep red. You can't be serious. But Donovan was already stepping aside, giving her a clear path toward the exit. The 2 officers flanked her, not touching her, but making it clear that her time here was up. The crowd watched in silence as she stalked toward the exit, her once perfect posture now riddled with tension. Every step was a blow to the privilege she had wielded like a weapon for decades. As she pushed through the doors, Shaq turned to Donovan. Thanks for handling that the right way. Donovan nodded. You built this place. You belong here. Shaq glanced at the crowd, then back at Donovan. So does everyone else. A slow, approving nod from Donovan. The tension in the room finally dissolved. Employees returned to work. Customers continued shopping. But there was an unmistakable shift in the air. A newfound respect. A realization that change had taken root in a place that had once been controlled by an old way of thinking. Shaq took a deep breath, then smiled slightly. This wasn't just about one confrontation. This was about something much bigger. And for the first time in a long time, he knew the world had been forced to see it. By the time Victoria Calloway stormed out of the mall, the damage was irreversible. But not for Shaq. The weight of her mistake hadn't hit her yet, but it would. And when it did, it would hit like a wrecking ball. Outside, her fingers trembled as she gripped her phone, her mind racing. She needed to control the fallout, fast. She had built her reputation on power and influence, but this was spiraling out of control. As she scrolled through her notifications, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Her own face was staring back at her. A video, already viral, already damning. The caption made her breath hitch. Racist Karen tries to kick millionaire out of his own mall. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she clicked on the footage. There she was, her superior smirk, her sharp tone, the way she pointed at Shaq like she was issuing an order. Then, the moment of public reckoning, when Shaq revealed the undeniable truth. He owned the mall. The laughter, the shift in power, the exact words she had said. People like this. Her cheeks burned as she swiped away, but it was useless. The internet had already decided her fate. Big Shaq Owns was trending. Grinding her teeth, she dialed the only person who could help her navigate this mess. James, she snapped when her brother picked up. Fix this. Meanwhile, inside the mall, Shaq leaned against the glass railing on the second floor, watching the ripples of conversation still spreading through the space. Employees whispered behind counters. Customers exchanged knowing glances, and phone screens glowed as the moment replayed over and over again online. Brandon Ross, his operations manager, strode up beside him, his phone buzzing nonstop. "Shaq," he said, shaking his head. "This is getting wild." Shaq smirked. "Good wild or bad wild?" Brandon turned the phone toward him. "Take a look." On the screen, news outlets were already running the footage. The story had exploded beyond social media, now dominating major headlines. Mall owner Shaquille O'Neal racially profiled in his own business. The power of privilege. Victoria Calloway faces backlash after viral confrontation. Even millionaires aren't safe from racism. Shaq's experience sparks national debate. Shaq sighed. He had been in the spotlight for decades. Championship wins, business ventures, TV appearances. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger. Across town, Victoria paced like a caged animal in her high-rise penthouse, her perfectly curated world cracking at the edges. She had spent the last hour calling every connection she had, but no one wanted to be publicly associated with her now. Not in the middle of a firestorm. Even James, her brother, the one person who had always cleaned up her messes, sounded exasperated. "Vic, listen to me," he said over the phone. "This isn't some minor scandal. Investors are backing away. People are calling for boycotts." "I was protecting the community," Victoria snapped. "I did what any responsible person would do." James sighed. "No, Victoria. You were caught on camera trying to humiliate the owner of a multi-million-dollar business. This isn't going away." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. "So what do I do? Let them destroy me?" James hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You play the victim." Victoria stopped pacing. "Explain." James exhaled. "We rewrite the narrative. We paint you as a woman who was simply misunderstood, who was trying to maintain safety, and now you're being unfairly attacked." A slow, calculating smile curled on Victoria's lips. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Victoria's PR team struck back. A carefully worded statement appeared across media outlets. "I deeply regret any misunderstandings that occurred. My actions were motivated solely by a commitment to maintaining a safe and welcoming environment for all patrons. It was never my intention to offend or target anyone, and I am saddened by how this situation has been unfairly portrayed." The moment Shaq read it, he laughed out loud. Brandon, sitting across from him, rolled his eyes. "So now she's the victim?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, tossing his phone onto the desk. "Classic move." Brandon smirked. "So how do we respond?" Shaq thought for a moment. "We don't." Brandon raised a brow. "You sure about that?" Shaq nodded. "She wants us to engage. If we fire back, she'll cry about cancel culture and spin this even further. But the truth is already out there. People know." Brandon grinned. "Smart play." Shaq exhaled, standing up. "But we're not letting this moment go to waste." Brandon's expression turned curious. "What do you have in mind?" Shaq's gaze hardened with purpose. "Something bigger than a social media moment." That night, while Victoria's fake apology was being picked apart online, Shaq made his own move. Instead of addressing her, he posted a video. Not about the incident, not about Victoria, but about ownership. "Let's talk about access," he said into the camera. "Let's talk about opportunity, about how places like this mall weren't always meant for people like me, and how even when we build them, there are still people who think we don't belong." He leaned forward slightly. "That's why I'm launching something new. A program to help more Black entrepreneurs get into commercial real estate. To own, not just rent. To build, not just shop." The reaction was immediate. The internet exploded. This is how you turn a moment into a movement. Shaq just did more in one post than most politicians do in a lifetime. "I need to be part of this." The media pivoted. The story was no longer about Victoria's ignorance. It was about Black ownership, generational wealth, and opportunity. And Victoria. She had officially lost control of the narrative. Days passed, and Victoria's downfall accelerated. Investors distanced themselves. Invitations to exclusive fundraisers vanished. The very system she had wielded for years was now closing its doors on her. Shaq, on the other hand, was more powerful than ever. And the best part? He never had to say her name again. Victoria Calloway had spent her life controlling others. Now the world had taken control of her story, and it was one she would never escape. By the next morning, the story had evolved beyond social media hysteria. It was now a full-blown media storm. What had started as a viral video had been dissected, analyzed, and twisted by news networks, each tailoring the narrative to suit their audience. Progressive outlets rallied behind Shaq, exposing the underlying racial bias at play. Their headlines were blunt and unfiltered. Shaquille O'Neal faces racial profiling in his own mall. Even millionaires aren't safe, the reality of everyday discrimination. Victoria Calloway tried to police a black-owned business, and it backfired. Meanwhile, conservative networks went into damage control mode for Victoria, spinning the incident into a story of cancel culture gone too far. They painted Shaq as a bully, portraying Victoria as a misunderstood businesswoman who had simply made an unfortunate mistake. Entrepreneur faces backlash after attempting to maintain mall order. Did Shaquille O'Neal weaponize his fame to humiliate a woman? Cancel culture claims another victim. Shaq had expected this. Truth didn't matter in the world of media battles. What mattered was perception, and perception was something Victoria still had the money and connections to manipulate. At the O'Neal Grand Plaza executive offices, the mood was tense. Shaq sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by his closest advisors. Across from him, his lead attorney, Derek Vaughn, methodically flipped through a stack of legal documents, while Brandon Ross scrolled through a wave of investor emails, his expression darkening with each one. Brandon finally exhaled, looking up. Some of our top retailers are getting jittery. They're worried about public image risks and possible boycotts. Shaq frowned. Because I own the place? Derek cleared his throat. Because this situation isn't cooling down. Victoria's people are pushing hard behind the scenes. They're making calls, framing this as a case of misinterpretation rather than racial bias. Investors don't want to be caught in the middle of that fight. Shaq's fingers drummed against the table. He had built this mall from the ground up. And now, because of one woman's ignorance, his ownership was being questioned? Brandon hesitated. It gets worse. He turned his tablet around, showing a freshly released op-ed from a business journal. The headline made Shaq's stomach turn. Is Shaquille O'Neal fit to manage a business empire? The article didn't attack him outright, but the implication was clear. It subtly questioned whether Shaq, as a former athlete, had the business acumen to manage something as large as O'Neal Grand Plaza. It suggested that the mall might be better off under more experienced leadership. Shaq's jaw clenched. He knew what this was. It was Victoria's last weapon: doubt. If she couldn't destroy him publicly, she'd try to erode his credibility in the boardroom. Meanwhile, in an upscale private office, Victoria Calloway sat across from her brother James Calloway, a powerful real estate investor with deep political ties. She was composed now, her earlier panic replaced with cold calculation. "They're making me the villain," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were clippings of op-eds, investor concerns, and legal discussions about Shaq's fitness as an owner. James leaned back in his chair. "You overplayed your hand, Victoria. The public isn't buying your version of the story." Victoria scoffed. "The public doesn't matter. Investors do." James glanced through the folder, nodding slightly. "You've done well getting them rattled. But forcing him out? That's another thing entirely." Victoria leaned in. "Not if we hit him from every angle." James sighed. "And if this backfires?" Victoria's eyes flashed. "Then we make sure it doesn't." Back at the mall, Shaq stood on the rooftop parking deck, staring out over the city he had helped shape. He had spent his entire career fighting for legitimacy beyond basketball. And now, after building something that was truly his, they wanted to take it away. Brandon joined him, his voice cautious. "We need a plan." Shaq exhaled slowly. "We have two choices." Brandon crossed his arms. "Go public or handle it privately." Shaq nodded. "If we fight publicly, we expose everything. Victoria's smear campaign, her influence buying, the investors being manipulated." Brandon smirked. "Tempting. But if we handle it privately," Shaq continued, "we work behind the scenes. We lock down investor confidence, make Victoria a liability, and push her out of the picture without saying a word. Brandon nodded. Which way are you leaning? Shaq's gaze hardened. We take away the one thing she really values. Brandon's brows furrowed. And that is? Shaq turned to him, a slow smirk forming. Power. Brandon grinned. Now we're talking. That night, while Victoria was busy calling in favors, Shaq was making his own moves. His legal team met with key investors behind closed doors, reassuring them of his long-term vision. His PR team released new marketing campaigns, highlighting the mall's continued success. And quietly, certain calls were made to high-level contacts Victoria didn't even know he had. The shift was subtle at first. A few key investors publicly reaffirmed their support for Shaq. Major brands within the mall released statements distancing themselves from unnecessary controversy. And most damning of all, a high-profile city official who had previously supported Victoria suddenly pulled his backing. The foundation she had built her influence on? It was crumbling. The next morning, Victoria woke up to a different world. Instead of controlling the narrative, she was losing grip. Investors who had once entertained her concerns stopped returning her calls. Political figures who had been willing to listen distanced themselves. Then came the final blow. James called, his voice flat. It's over, Vic. Victoria sat up in bed. What are you talking about? James sighed. Shaq didn't fight you. He outmaneuvered you. Investors trust him. The city trusts him. You've lost your leverage. Victoria swallowed hard. There has to be another move. There isn't. A long pause. Then, walk away before you lose everything. For the first time in her life, Victoria Calloway had no control, and she had no one to blame but herself. Shaq had dealt with challenges before, on the court, in business, in life. But this was a different kind of battle. One where the rules weren't written, where power wasn't earned but manipulated. And Victoria? She was willing to burn everything down to get what she wanted. The first sign that things were escalating came in the form of anonymous threats. At first, they were subtle. An email from an untraceable account warning him to walk away before things get ugly. A letter, no return address, suggesting he consider selling before the situation got worse. Then, they became bolder. A call to his assistant, a distorted voice whispering threats. A package left outside his office containing a single message. Some places don't belong to you. Brandon stormed into Shaq's office, phone in hand. This is getting out of control, he said, voice tight with frustration. You need security around the clock. Shaq exhaled, staring at the threatening note in his hand. This isn't fear, he said. This is desperation. Brandon scoffed. Yeah, well, desperate people do stupid things. Meanwhile, the community wasn't staying silent. News of Victoria's power plays and behind-the-scenes influence had spread, and people weren't having it. Employees at the mall organized peaceful protests, signs, chants, a growing presence in the plaza. Customers voiced their outrage, calling out the injustice of trying to strip a black man of what he built. The footage went viral. O'Neal Grand Plaza belongs to the people. We stand with Shaq. This isn't just business, this is a message. But Shaq knew. Victoria wasn't done. If she couldn't win the public, she'd try to bury him in legal warfare. At a high-rise law firm downtown, Victoria sat across from her new legal team, specialists in corporate takeovers, real estate loopholes, and courtroom battles designed to drain an opponent's resources. We're challenging his ownership rights, one of the lawyers said, sliding a document across the desk. If we can prove that certain zoning laws were ignored or that the acquisition wasn't properly processed, we can tie him up in litigation for years. Victoria smirked. Perfect. James, sitting beside her, looked uneasy. Vic, do you really want to take this that far? Victoria's gaze hardened. I want to win. Shaq's legal team received the notice the next morning. Derek, his attorney, read through it twice before letting out a slow, controlled breath. She's going after the foundation of your ownership, he said. This isn't about winning a case. It's about stalling you, draining you, forcing you into a settlement. Shaq leaned back in his chair. And if I fight it? Derek sighed. Then you're looking at a multi-year legal battle. Courtrooms, depositions, endless paperwork. It'll be expensive, exhausting. And even if you win, you'll be bleeding by the end of it. Shaq nodded slowly. Victoria was playing dirty. Brandon, sitting across from them, folded his arms. So, what do we do? A long silence filled the room. Shaq knew there were only two real choices: fight back through the courts, prepare for war, and risk years of headaches. Or play chess, make one move that would end this for good. Shaq's fingers tapped against the desk. His mind was already working. Then he looked up, a slow, knowing smirk on his face. We expose her. Brandon raised a brow. You sure? Shaq's voice was calm, deliberate. We don't need to beat her in court. We just need to make sure she can't fight at all. Brandon grinned. Now that's the Shaq I know. The final move was coming. And when it landed, Victoria wouldn't just lose. She'd be finished. Shaq didn't waste time. If Victoria wanted a war, she was about to get one. On his terms. He called in a team of private investigators, people who specialized in peeling back the layers of the rich and powerful. Their job? Find out everything about Victoria Calloway. What they uncovered was worse than even Shaq expected. Shady business deals, backdoor bribes, misuse of public funds. But the real bombshell? Victoria had a history of racial discrimination lawsuits, ones that had been buried quietly over the years. A former employee at one of her businesses had once accused her of firing black staff disproportionately. Another lawsuit alleged that she steered investments away from black-owned businesses in her portfolio. None of these cases had ever gone to trial. She had paid them off, hushed them up, and walked away untouched. Until now. Because now, Shaq had receipts. Brandon paced Shaq's office, scanning the thick file of evidence the investigators had compiled. This is brutal, he muttered. Once this goes public, she's done. Shaq leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Good. Derek, his attorney, raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about this, Shaq? This isn't just about proving her wrong. This will end her. Shaq's voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. She wanted to bury me. I'm just showing people the truth. Brandon grinned. So how do we drop this bomb? Shaq exhaled, then smiled. We let the world do it for us. It started with a single leaked document. A news outlet received an anonymous tip, legal records linking Victoria to multiple racial discrimination settlements. Within hours, the internet had receipts. Victoria Calloway's history of racial bias, the cases she paid to disappear. New evidence links businesswoman to illegal investment manipulation. Did Victoria Calloway try to erase black-owned businesses? Social media erupted. Victoria tried to fight back. She released a statement. She called the allegations mischaracterizations and outdated misunderstandings. But the internet doesn't forget. And they definitely don't forgive. Within 24 hours, her world collapsed. Investors pulled out. Board members distanced themselves. And then came the final blow. The city launched an official investigation into her finances. In a desperate attempt to control the narrative, Victoria called an emergency press conference. She stepped up to the podium, her usual polished confidence fractured. Cameras flashed, microphones buzzed, and she forced a smile. I am a victim of a coordinated attack, she began. These baseless accusations. But she never got to finish her sentence. Because at that exact moment, her phone buzzed. Then another. Then another. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A new video had just surfaced. Live. An old recording, Victoria at a private fundraiser, complaining about certain people taking over the city. Her own words, her own voice. And just like that, it was over. Shaq didn't watch the rest of the press conference. He didn't need to. He was sitting in his office when Derek walked in, phone in hand, eyes wide. You won't believe this. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Try me. Derek handed him the phone. An email from the mall's board of directors. Unanimous vote. Full backing of Shaq's ownership. Victoria had lost everything. And Shaq? He had secured his legacy forever. Brandon exhaled, shaking his head. Man, that was a checkmate if I've ever seen one. Shaq leaned back, staring at the city skyline. Nah, that was justice. Victoria Calloway vanished from public life. In less than a week, she had gone from an untouchable power player to a disgraced figure whose name was now synonymous with corruption and prejudice. Her social media accounts were deactivated. Her businesses crumbled as partners and investors abandoned her. News outlets that once catered to her influence now dissected her downfall. But while Victoria faded into obscurity, the conversation she sparked refused to die. Shaq knew that moments like these could either fade into viral memory or become a catalyst for real change. He chose the latter. In a highly anticipated press conference held at O'Neal Grand Plaza, Shaq stood behind the podium, the city skyline gleaming behind him. The weight of the past weeks was evident in his eyes, but so was something else: purpose. This was never just about me, Shaq began, his deep voice carrying over the hushed crowd. This was about something bigger, about who gets to own, who gets to lead, who gets to exist in spaces without being questioned. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Leaders, activists, business owners, everyday people who had watched the battle unfold in real time. I don't just want to move past this, Shaq continued. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to the next person trying to build something of their own. And with that, he announced something bigger than anyone expected. A new initiative, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to helping Black entrepreneurs break into commercial real estate. Low-interest loans for Black business owners. Educational programs on wealth building and ownership. A mentorship network led by successful Black investors. The crowd erupted into applause. The impact was immediate. Major companies pledged support. Wealthy investors stepped forward. A movement was forming, one that would last far longer than any trending hashtag. And the mall? It became more than just a shopping center. It became a symbol. People visited not just to shop, but to stand in the place where a battle had been won. The story spread beyond the city, beyond the country. People everywhere were talking about what had happened at O'Neal Grand Plaza and what it meant. One afternoon, as Shaq walked through the mall, he noticed a young boy, no older than 10, staring up at him with wide eyes. The boy hesitated for a second before stepping forward. "Mr. Shaq?" he asked, voice small but steady. Shaq crouched down to his level. "What's up, little man?" The boy swallowed hard, then said something that made Shaq's chest tighten. "I want to be like you someday." Shaq blinked, taken aback by the quiet sincerity in the boy's voice. He glanced at the boy's mother, who stood a few steps away, pride and gratitude shining in her eyes. He looked back at the boy and smiled. "Nah, kid. You're gonna be better than me. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people stand their ground. When they refuse to be pushed out of the spaces they've earned. When they take moments of injustice and turn them into movements of power." Shaq had always been a fighter. But this was his biggest win yet, and it was just the beginning. In the end, Victoria Calloway didn't just lose a fight. She lost everything she once controlled. Her connections abandoned her, her influence crumbled, and the very system she had relied on to silence others turned its back on her. But for Shaq, this was never just about one victory. It was about what came next. He had proven his place, not because he had to, but because the world needed to see why these battles still exist. He didn't just defend himself. He built a future where others wouldn't have to. The shopping mall remained standing, not just as a place of business, but as a symbol of resilience, ownership, and justice. The headlines faded, but the impact didn't. The message was clear. Those who try to erase others will always be remembered for their failure. And for every young dreamer watching, Shaq's message remained the same. You don't just belong, you lead.